September 20th, 1944. The morning fog hung thick over the rolling hills of eastern France, clinging to the earth like a heavy blanket that refused to be lifted. Near the town of Aricourt, in the Lorraine region, American forces of the 4th Armored Division were about to face one of the fiercest armored counterattacks the Germans would launch in the Western European campaign. But hidden somewhere in that dense morning mist was a tiny fabric-covered aircraft, no bigger than a family car, piloted by a man who had once stood before high school students teaching the dates of ancient battles. Now, he was about to make history himself. This is the story of Charles Carpenter, a mild-mannered history teacher from Illinois who would become known as Bazooka Charlie, the Mad Major, a man whose audacious innovation in a tiny reconnaissance plane would forever change the way modern militaries think about close air support. It's a story that begins not in the skies over France, but in the quiet classrooms of Middle America, where a young educator dreamed of adventure beyond textbooks and chalkboard. The year was 1941, and the world was already burning. Europe had been at war for 2 years. The German war machine had rolled across Poland, France, and the Low Countries with terrifying efficiency. Britain stood alone, battered but defiant, and in the Pacific, storm clouds were gathering over a place called Pearl Harbor. Charles Merle Carpenter was 29 years old, teaching history at Moline High School in Illinois, a small industrial town perched on the Mississippi River. He had a wife, Elda May, and a comfortable life that many men would have been content to maintain while the world tore itself apart across distant oceans. But Charles Carpenter was not like most men. Behind his scholarly demeanor and gentle philosopher's bearing lived a warrior's heart, a man who believed deeply in action over contemplation when action was required. He had been educated on scholarships at the Roosevelt Military Academy in nearby Aledo and later at Center College in Kentucky. He knew discipline, he understood duty, and when America finally entered the war in December 1941, he knew his place would not be behind a desk while others fought and perished. In 1942, Carpenter made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life, and though he could not have known it then, the future of military aviation. He enlisted in the United States Army, volunteering for flight training. He left behind the safety of the classroom, the familiar rhythm of lesson plans and grading papers, and stepped into a world of uncertainty and danger. His students watched their history teacher become history himself, a living embodiment of the courage and sacrifice he had taught them about in abstract terms. The Army recognized something in Carpenter, a quality that marked him as exceptional. After completing flight training, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant and assigned a role that would become his destiny. He would be an artillery spotter, a liaison pilot flying one of the Army's L-4 Grasshoppers, the military designation for America's most beloved civilian aircraft, the Piper J-3 Cub. To understand Carpenter's story, we must first understand the remarkable little aircraft that would become his partner in this extraordinary adventure. The Piper Cub was never intended to be a weapon of war. It was born in the depths of the Great Depression, the brainchild of engineer Clarence Taylor and industrialist William Piper, two men who believed that flying should be accessible to ordinary Americans, not just the wealthy elite. The Cub was their answer, a simple, reliable, affordable airplane that anyone could learn to fly. The design was elegance in its simplicity. A high-wing monoplane with a welded steel tube fuselage covered in fabric, it looked almost toy-like, painted in bright yellow with a distinctive black lightning bolt running its length. It seated 2 people in tandem, one behind the other, and was powered by a modest 4-cylinder engine producing just 65 horsepower. To put that in perspective, a modern lawnmower often has more power. The Cub's maximum speed was a leisurely 85 miles per hour, barely faster than cars on a highway. It could stall at just 38 miles per hour, which meant it could practically hover in a stiff headwind. But what the Cub lacked in speed and power, it more than made up for in other qualities. It could take off in less than 300 feet, land in even less, and operate from the roughest fields, dirt roads, or meadows. It was forgiving to fly, gentle in its handling, making it perfect for training new pilots. By the time America entered World War II, thousands of Americans had learned to fly in Piper Cubs through the civilian pilot training program. In fact, An astonishing 80% of all American military pilots in the war would receive their first flight training in a Cub. When the Army needed a light observation aircraft for artillery spotting and reconnaissance, the Cub was the obvious choice. They painted it olive drab instead of yellow, added some plexiglass panels for better visibility, designated it the L-4 Grasshopper, and sent it to war. As Bill Piper Jr., son of the company founder, would later quip with characteristic understatement, all we had to do was paint the Cub olive drab to produce a military airplane. The Army's thinking was straightforward. Modern artillery could strike targets far beyond what any soldier on the ground could see. If you could get eyes in the sky, even modest eyes flying low and slow, you could direct devastating firepower with unprecedented accuracy. The L-4 Grasshopper, equipped with a new lightweight FM radio, could become the eyes of the artillery, spotting enemy positions and adjusting fire in real time. It was a revolution in combined arms warfare, though few fully appreciated it at the time. These tiny aircraft began seeing action in North Africa, then Sicily and Italy. They proved their worth repeatedly. German gunners learned quickly that when they saw a grasshopper overhead, artillery fire would soon follow. Many chose not to fire at the unarmed observers, fearing that their muzzle flashes would give away their positions and bring down a storm of American shells. The humble Grasshopper became one of the most feared aircraft in the American arsenal, not because of its own weapons, but because of the devastation it could call down from miles away. By the summer of 1944, Major Charles Carpenter found himself in France, part of the massive Allied force that had stormed ashore on the beaches of Normandy on June 6th. He was now attached to the 4th Armored Division, part of General George Patton's legendary Third Army. Patton was a hard-charging, aggressive commander who believed in rapid movement, bold strikes, and unrelenting pressure on the enemy. His armored divisions were the spearhead of the American advance across France, racing toward Germany itself. Carpenter's job was clear. He would fly his L-4 ahead of the advancing tanks, spotting enemy positions, calling in artillery fire, and providing reconnaissance. It was important work, dangerous work. Artillery spotters faced mortality rates that would make even bomber crews blanch. Estimates suggested that between 70 and 80% of spotter pilots would be lost during the course of the war, flying low and slow over hostile territory, exposed to ground fire from every angle. These men were sitting ducks if the enemy decided they were worth shooting at. The French countryside that summer was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Fields of golden wheat stretched toward distant forests, and ancient stone villages crowned the hilltops. But beneath that pastoral beauty lay a landscape of war. German forces, though retreating, were far from defeated. They had fortified towns and established defensive lines. Their artillery still boomed across the valleys. Their tanks, the fearsome panthers and tigers, prowled the roads and hedgerows, and above it all the grasshoppers buzzed like hornets, watching, reporting, directing American guns onto German positions. At first, Carpenter performed his duties with the professionalism expected of an Army officer. He flew his reconnaissance missions, spotted enemy concentrations, called in coordinates to the artillery battalions below, and watched the results through his binoculars. But as the weeks passed, something began to gnaw at him. He was a man of action, trapped in a role of observation. He could see the enemy, he could mark their positions, but he couldn't directly engage them. The closest he came to combat was watching distant explosions when his artillery strikes found their marks. This was a peculiar kind of frustration for a warrior. Carpenter would later describe his philosophy of war in stark, uncompromising terms. "My idea of fighting a war is to attack, and then attack again," he told a reporter. In another interview, he elaborated, "Some people around here think I'm crazy, but I just believe that if we're going to fight a war, we have to get on with it 60 minutes an hour and 24 hours a day. But how does a man in a fabric-covered observation plane, equipped with nothing more than binoculars and a radio, attack?" The L-4 carried no weapons. It wasn't designed for combat. It was slower than almost any military aircraft in the sky, more fragile than a dragonfly, and about as threatening to an armored tank as a housefly to an elephant, or so it seemed. The spark of inspiration came from observing his fellow pilots. A few innovative Grasshopper pilots had begun experimenting with a radical idea. The M1 bazooka, officially designated the M1A1 rocket launcher, was a standard infantry anti-tank weapon. It was essentially a long metal tube that fired a rocket-propelled grenade capable of penetrating armor plate. The weapon itself weighed just over 13 pounds, and it was designed to be carried and operated by a soldier on foot. But what if, these pilots wondered, you could mount bazookas on the wings of a grasshopper? When Carpenter saw what these innovators had done, something clicked in his mind. This was the answer. This was how a grasshopper could become not just an observer, but a predator. He approached his commanding officers with a proposal that must have seemed absolutely insane. He wanted to arm his unarmed observation aircraft with anti-tank rockets and hunt German armor from the sky. The reaction from headquarters was predictable skepticism mixed with concern. The L-4 had a maximum weight capacity, including pilot and any cargo, of just over 400 pounds. Mounting heavy weapons on the wings would affect the aircraft's already marginal performance. More importantly, this would fundamentally change the nature of Grasshopper missions. If Carpenter started attacking tanks, the Germans would start shooting back in earnest. Not just occasionally, but every time they saw him, he would be painting a target on his own back. But Charles Carpenter was persuasive, and persistence was one of his defining qualities. He argued that the potential reward justified the risk. A single well-placed rocket could disable a tank that might otherwise wreak havoc on American ground forces. If his little plane could take out even a handful of enemy armor, it would be worth it. Eventually, perhaps more out of curiosity than confidence, his commanders gave him permission to experiment. Working with an ordnance technician and his crew chief, Carpenter set about transforming his Grasshopper from observer to hunter. They started conservatively, mounting 2 M1 bazookas to the wing struts, one on each side. The bazookas were wired into the cockpit, allowing Carpenter to fire them electrically by flipping switches from his pilot's seat. Each launcher could fire a single M6 rocket with a high-explosive anti-tank warhead capable of penetrating approximately 3 inches of armor at a 30-degree impact angle. Carpenter christened his modified aircraft Rosie the Rocketer, a play on Rosie the Riveter, the iconic symbol of American women working in war industries. It was a name that captured both the audacity and the almost comical improbability of what he was attempting. This gentle schoolteacher was going to hunt 40-ton German tanks in a fabric-covered observation plane armed with infantry weapons. The first test flights revealed both promise and problems. The added weight of the bazookas affected the Cub's performance, making it even more sluggish than usual. But Carpenter discovered that the Grasshopper's very weaknesses could be turned into strengths. Its slow speed meant he could loiter over targets, taking his time to line up shots. Its ability to fly very low allowed him to use terrain for cover, popping up to take a shot before diving back down behind trees or hills. And most importantly, his plane was so quiet that he could sometimes approach enemy positions nearly silently, especially if he glided in with the engine at idle. After some experimentation and growing confidence, Carpenter decided that 2 bazookas weren't enough. He added 2 more, then 2 more again, until Rosie the Rocketer sported 6 bazooka tubes, 3 mounted on each wing. This configuration gave him multiple shots before having to return to base for rearming. It also increased his chances of scoring a hit, since aiming a rocket from a moving, vibrating aircraft at a moving or stationary tank was far from an exact science. By September 1944, Carpenter was actively hunting. He would take off in the early morning when the light was soft and visibility good, and prowl the countryside ahead of the American advance. He looked for the telltale signs of German armor, the distinctive shapes of panthers and tigers hiding in tree lines, the dust clouds raised by moving columns, the glint of morning sun on steel. When he found a target, he would circle wide, using hills or forests to mask his approach, then dive toward the enemy, firing his rockets in quick succession before banking hard and accelerating away, the little Cub's engine screaming at full throttle. The tactics were simple but effective. Carpenter aimed for the top armor of German tanks, which was thinner than the frontal or side armor. A hit on the turret top or engine deck could disable or destroy even the formidable Tiger, a tank that was nearly invulnerable to frontal assault by most Allied weapons. The rocket, fired from above in a diving attack, struck at the tank's Achilles heel. German crews quickly realized that the harmless-looking grasshoppers were no longer harmless. Word spread among German units to watch out for Cubs with bazookas. Carpenter would later recount with dark satisfaction what a Stars and Stripes correspondent told him. "The word must be getting around to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them," Carpenter said. "Every time I show up now, they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother Cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit." Indeed, the response from German forces became ferocious. Anti-aircraft guns that had previously ignored the grasshoppers now opened fire with everything they had. German infantry would blast away with machine pistols and rifles. On one mission, as Carpenter banked steeply around a tall oak tree to line up a shot on a German tank, enemy soldiers below opened up with their weapons. He felt the impacts as 9mm rounds punched through the fabric of his wing. He jinked hard, putting the tree between himself and the shooters, and accelerated away, the holes in his wing fluttering in the slipstream. Back at base, his crew chief counted the bullet holes and shook his head in disbelief that Carpenter was still alive. But the most dramatic and significant day of Carpenter's war came on September 20th, 1944, during what would become known as the Battle of Aricourt. This engagement would prove to be one of the largest tank battles on the Western Front, second only to the later Battle of the Bulge. The German 5th Panzer Army had launched a desperate counteroffensive, attempting to push back the American advance and recapture lost territory. They assembled a formidable force of Panther tanks and armored vehicles, intending to smash through American lines and cause havoc in the rear areas. That morning dawned gray and cold. A thick fog, the kind that settles into the valleys of France in early autumn, covered the entire region. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. The American forces of the 4th Armored Division were spread out across the countryside, some units in defensive positions, others preparing for their own offensive operations. They had no idea that a German armored column was moving toward them through the fog, invisible and undetected. Major Carpenter received word that enemy activity was suspected in the area around Aricourt, but the fog made visual reconnaissance impossible. Nevertheless, he decided to take off, hoping that altitude might allow him to climb above the fog bank and see what was happening on the ground. He warmed up Rosie the Rocketer's engine, checked his instruments, and lifted off from the muddy field that served as his airstrip. As the Grasshopper climbed through the fog, Carpenter found himself in a strange, gray world. Below him, only whiteness. Above him, the same colorless void. He flew a search pattern, turning slowly, trying to find any break in the weather that might let him see the ground. For hours he circled, frustrated and worried. He knew something was happening down there, could almost feel it, but the fog kept it secret. Then, around noon, as if on command from some unseen director, the fog began to lift. Not all at once, but gradually, thinning and tearing into wisps. Holes appeared, and through these holes, Carpenter began to see the ground. At first, just glimpses. A field, a road, a cluster of buildings. Then suddenly, he saw them. Tanks, not American Shermans, but German Panthers, their distinctive angular hulls unmistakable even from above. And not just a few, but an entire company, perhaps 20 or more, accompanied by armored cars and half-tracks filled with infantry. The German column was moving directly toward American positions that Carpenter knew were lightly defended at that moment. If those Panthers reached the headquarters elements and supply units in Aricourt, they would cause a catastrophe. Men would die, equipment would be destroyed, and the entire American advance could be jeopardized. Carpenter didn't hesitate. He nosed the Cub over into a dive, picking up speed, the wind whistling through the wing struts and the still-present bullet holes from his previous mission. The Germans below saw him coming and reacted instantly. Suddenly, the air around him erupted with tracer fire, streams of bullets reaching up like deadly fingers trying to swat him from the sky. Machine guns on the vehicles opened up, and infantry on the ground joined in with their rifles and submachine guns. The sound was like being inside a hailstorm, except the hail was made of lead and moving at supersonic speeds. Carpenter held his dive, his eyes fixed on the lead panther. He was low now, terrifyingly low, perhaps only 100 meters above the ground. His thumb found the firing switches, and he toggled them, in rapid succession. The bazookas mounted on his wings fired, one after another, the rockets leaving trails of white smoke as they streaked toward the German column. Then he was pulling up hard, the Cub's controls stiff in his hands, climbing and banking, trying to present a moving target to the gunners below. He didn't have time to assess the damage. His bazooka tubes were empty, and he needed to get away before a lucky shot brought him down. He turned toward his base, flying as fast as the little Cub could manage, which was still absurdly slow by military aircraft standards. Behind him, smoke rose from the German column, but he couldn't be sure what he'd hit. Back at base, his ground crew was ready. They had been listening to the radio traffic, knew that Carpenter had made contact with a major German force, and understood he would be coming back for more ammunition. They worked frantically, reloading the bazooka tubes with fresh rockets, while Carpenter climbed out of the cockpit, stretched his cramped muscles, and grabbed a quick drink of water. 10 minutes later, he was airborne again. The fog had cleared completely now, leaving the battlefield exposed under the gray September sky. Carpenter found the German column easily, following the black smoke of burning vehicles. The Germans, having learned their lesson, were now watching the sky with paranoid intensity. The moment he appeared, they opened fire with everything. The volume of fire was incredible, a solid wall of tracer rounds rising to meet him. But Carpenter was committed. He dove again, fired his rockets, pulled up, and flew away through the maelstrom. He made that round trip 3 times that afternoon. 3 times he loaded up with rockets, flew back to the battle, dove through the German fire, attacked, and survived. By the end of the day, he had fired no fewer than 16 bazooka rockets at the advancing German force. The official after-action reports would credit him with disabling 2 Panther tanks and several armored cars, as well as causing casualties among the German infantry. But the numbers don't tell the full story. Carpenter's attacks did more than just destroy a few vehicles. They disrupted the entire German advance. Tank commanders, suddenly facing attacks from above by a weapon they had thought was harmless, became cautious. They slowed down, spread out, looked for cover. The psychological impact was enormous. When soldiers fear an attack can come from any direction at any moment, their effectiveness drops dramatically. They become defensive, reactive rather than proactive. Moreover, Carpenter's presence and attacks bought time for American ground forces to respond. Radio operators had called in reports of the German attack, and reinforcements were being rushed to the area. Artillery was being repositioned. Tank destroyer units were moving into ambush positions. All of this took time that would not have been available if the German column had been able to advance unimpeded. There was one other critical effect. A group of American support troops, including a water point crew that had been providing fresh water to combat units, had been cut off by the German advance. They were trapped, watching helplessly as enemy tanks moved toward their position, knowing they had no weapons capable of stopping armor. They had resigned themselves to capture or worse, but then they saw Rosie the Rocketer diving again and again at the German column, saw the tanks stop and retreat, saw an opportunity to escape. They did, racing back to American lines with a story of rescue by a crazy major in a Cub covered with bazookas. After the 3rd sortie that day, Carpenter's aircraft was riddled with new holes. The fabric covering the wings and fuselage looked like Swiss cheese in places. How he had survived was a mystery even to him. One bullet had passed within inches of his head, punching through both sides of the cockpit. Another had severed a control cable, which had miraculously continued to function despite being partially cut. When his crew chief inspected the aircraft after that final landing, he declared it was held together by nothing more than prayers and luck, and not much of either. The next day, September 21st, the Battle of Oracourt continued. The Germans, regrouping from the previous day's setback, launched another attack. This time, American forces were ready. Artillery opened up with devastating effect, having been pre-positioned based on intelligence from reconnaissance flights, many flown by Carpenter himself in the preceding days. Tank destroyer units caught German armor in carefully prepared ambush positions. The result was a decisive American victory, with German losses so severe that they would never mount another major offensive in that sector of the front. Historians would later recognize the Battle of Oracourt as one of the most significant armored engagements of the war in Western Europe. The American 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army, had decisively defeated a German armored counteroffensive, inflicting losses the Germans could ill afford and clearing the way for the final push toward Germany itself. And while the victory involved thousands of soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and massive artillery barrages, at a critical moment on that fog-shrouded September morning, it had also involved one man in a tiny aircraft doing something that should have been impossible. Carpenter's reputation spread rapidly through the Army. Newspapers back home picked up his story. The Associated Press, Stars and Stripes, the New York Sun, Liberty Magazine, and Popular Science all ran articles about Bazooka Charlie, the Mad Major, the schoolteacher who had traded his classroom for a cockpit and become a tank ace in an observation plane. The stories captivated the American public. In a war filled with technological marvels, massive bombers, fast fighters, powerful battleships, here was a David and Goliath tale, an ordinary man in an ordinary little plane doing extraordinary things. But Carpenter wasn't satisfied with just flying. His aggressive nature sometimes led him into ground combat as well. On one occasion, while scouting for landing fields, he came across an American tank and infantry formation that had been stopped by German 88mm artillery fire. These 88s were among the most feared weapons in the German arsenal, dual-purpose guns that could destroy tanks or shoot down aircraft with equal ease. The American advance had stalled, pinned down by accurate fire from the concealed guns. Carpenter made a decision that still seems almost incomprehensible. He landed his L-4 in a field, jumped out, ran to the lead Sherman tank, and climbed aboard. The surprised tank crew found themselves being yelled at by an Army Air Forces major they'd never met. Carpenter grabbed the tank's .50 caliber machine gun, fired a burst in the direction of the German positions, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Let's go! Attack!" Remarkably, they did. The tanks and infantry, inspired or perhaps stunned by this madman who had literally fallen from the sky to lead them, surged forward. The attack succeeded, driving the Germans back and eliminating the 88 positions. Carpenter then calmly returned to his aircraft, took off, and continued his reconnaissance mission as if nothing unusual had happened. On another occasion, he took out several German armored vehicles with his bazookas, then did something even more audacious. He landed in a field near the disabled vehicles, got out of his plane with nothing but a sidearm, and captured 6 German soldiers who had survived the attack. He found some abandoned German rifles, commandeered them, and marched his prisoners back to his plane at gunpoint. When an American tank column came rumbling down the road, Carpenter flagged them down and turned over his prisoners, then flew away again. These stories sound almost too incredible to be true, the kind of tall tales that soldiers tell around campfires. But they are documented in official reports, corroborated by multiple witnesses, and reported by war correspondents who interviewed Carpenter and the men who served with him. Charles Carpenter really did these things. In a war filled with acts of courage, his exploits stood out for their sheer audacity and creativity. Other pilots tried to emulate Carpenter's success with mixed results. A few mounted bazookas on their own L-4s and attempted similar attacks. But as one contemporary newspaper account dryly noted, most of these pilots found that driving their frail craft into a hail of German small arms fire was extremely unhealthy and returned to their observation duties. Carpenter's success required not just courage, but also exceptional flying skill, tactical awareness, and perhaps a touch of what some might call recklessness, but others would recognize as calculated risk-taking. By war's end, Major Carpenter was officially credited with destroying or disabling at least 6 German tanks, though many believe the true number was higher, possibly as many as 14, including 2 fearsome Tiger tanks. He had also destroyed numerous armored cars and other vehicles, and had caused significant casualties among German ground forces. But beyond the cold statistics of destruction, his impact was felt in other ways. Carpenter's exploits demonstrated something that military theorists had been arguing about for years, that light aircraft, properly employed and imaginatively equipped, could play a direct combat role beyond just observation. He had proven that close air support didn't always require fast fighters or heavy bombers. Sometimes all you needed was a pilot brave enough and creative enough to turn a weakness into a strength. The concept of using light observation aircraft aggressively would influence post-war military thinking. During the Korean War, which erupted just 5 years after World War II ended, L-4 Grasshoppers were still in service, still spotting for artillery, but now some were also equipped with weapons, directly attacking enemy positions. The lessons learned from Carpenter and others like him had been absorbed into military doctrine. As warfare evolved, so did the concept. In Vietnam, the Army would deploy hundreds of light observation helicopters, the OH-6 Cayuse, and later the OH-58 Kiowa, which filled a similar role to the old Grasshoppers, but with vertical takeoff and landing capabilities. These helicopters didn't just observe, they hunted. Armed with rockets and machine guns, they worked in conjunction with attack helicopters and ground forces in a ballet of combined arms warfare. The modern incarnation of Carpenter's legacy can be seen in today's military doctrine of close air support. The term itself refers to air action by fixed-wing or rotary-wing aircraft against hostile targets in close proximity to friendly forces, requiring detailed integration with ground forces' fire and movement. Contemporary close air support involves sophisticated aircraft like the A-10 Warthog, purpose-built for the mission, or armed drones that can loiter over a battlefield for hours, striking targets designated by troops on the ground. But the fundamental principle remains the same as what Carpenter proved in the skies over France. That air power, when closely coordinated with ground forces and delivered precisely where and when it's needed, can be decisive on the battlefield. The technology has changed dramatically, but the concept of a pilot in the air working directly with soldiers on the ground to identify and neutralize enemy threats traces its lineage directly back to those artillery spotters in their Grasshoppers, and to the crazy schoolteacher who decided that observation wasn't enough. Carpenter's war ended in 1945 under circumstances both triumphant and tragic. He had survived countless missions, cheated death more times than anyone could count, and earned numerous decorations, including the Air Medal and the Distinguished Flying Cross. But in the final months of the war in Europe, as Allied forces were closing in on Germany from all sides and victory was clearly in sight, Carpenter began to feel ill. At first, he dismissed it as exhaustion. The pace of operations had been relentless for months. He was flying multiple missions every day, often in terrible weather, always under the threat of enemy fire. But the fatigue grew worse, accompanied by other symptoms he couldn't ignore. Finally, in early 1945, he was ordered to report for a medical examination. The diagnosis was devastating. Hodgkin's disease, a form of cancer affecting the lymphatic system. In 1945, this was essentially a terminal diagnosis. The treatments available were primitive by modern standards, and the prognosis was grim. Doctors gave him perhaps 2 years to live, maybe less. He was sent home to America, to Illinois, to the life he had left behind when he enlisted. The man who had survived hundreds of combat missions, who had flown through storms of enemy fire, who had faced down German tanks in a fabric-covered observation plane, was now facing an enemy he couldn't fight with courage and determination alone. He received an honorable discharge from the Army in 1946 and returned to teaching, taking a position at Urbana High School in Illinois. But Charles Carpenter was not a man to surrender, not to cancer and not to despair. He had been given 2 years. He was determined to make them count. He taught with passion and dedication, sharing not just historical facts, but life lessons learned in combat. He ran a boys' summer camp in the Ozarks, teaching outdoor skills and character building, trying to pass on to the next generation the qualities he believed young men needed: courage, integrity, self-reliance, and the capacity for decisive action when circumstances demanded it. And remarkably, impossibly, 2 years passed, then 5, then 10. Carpenter outlived his prognosis by more than 2 decades, continuing to teach, continuing to inspire, continuing to live with the same intensity he had brought to combat. Perhaps the same determination that had made him attack German tanks in a Piper Cub also gave him the will to fight his disease far longer than anyone expected. He died on March 22, 1966, at the age of 53. He had lived long enough to see the world transform in ways he could hardly have imagined on that September day in 1944, when he dove through enemy fire in Rosie the Rocketer. He saw America rise to become the world's preeminent superpower. He witnessed the space race, watched men prepare to go to the moon. He saw a new generation of students grow up in a world shaped by the war he had fought. But perhaps most importantly, he saw the lessons of his wartime experience become foundational principles of modern military aviation. The integration of air and ground forces that he had pioneered on an individual level was now doctrine taught in service academies and practiced in every military operation. The idea that flexibility, creativity, and aggressive action could overcome technological limitations had become a core tenet of American military thinking. Today, Rosie the Rocketer herself survives. The actual aircraft that Major Carpenter flew, bearing the serial number 43426, was eventually located in Austria, where it had somehow ended up after the war. Restored to its wartime configuration, complete with the mounting brackets for 6 bazookas on its wings, it now resides in a museum, a tangible reminder of what one determined man could accomplish in an aircraft that had never been designed for combat. The story of Charles Carpenter and his Grasshopper resonates because it embodies something fundamental about the human spirit. Here was a man who could have stayed safe, who had every reason to remain an observer, but who chose instead to become a participant. He saw a problem. He couldn't directly engage the enemy, and he found a creative, audacious, some would say insane solution. He turned a weakness into a strength, transformed an observation platform into a weapon, and in doing so, he saved American lives and contributed to the Allied victory. His story also reminds us that military innovation doesn't always come from laboratories and design bureaus. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs happen on the battlefield, when ordinary soldiers and pilots facing extraordinary circumstances improvise solutions to immediate problems. The military-industrial complex, for all its resources and expertise, couldn't have designed what Carpenter created because no one in a design office would have thought to try. It took someone in the fight, someone who understood both the capabilities of the aircraft and the requirements of the mission, to see a possibility that others had missed. There's a deeper lesson here about leadership and initiative. Carpenter didn't wait for someone to tell him what to do. He saw an opportunity, requested permission, and when granted, he executed with determination and skill. He took ownership of his piece of the war, accepting the risks and responsibilities that came with his decision. In an era of large organizations and complex hierarchies, his example reminds us that individual initiative still matters, that one person with a good idea and the courage to pursue it can make a difference. The Piper Cub itself became one of the most successful and influential aircraft designs in aviation history. More than 20,000 were built, and many are still flying today, 75 years after production ended. They're still painted mostly in that distinctive Cub yellow, still taking off from grass strips and small airports, still introducing new generations of pilots to the joy of flight. When you see one flying overhead on a summer afternoon, gently cruising along at its leisurely pace, it's hard to imagine that aircraft of this same design once hunted German tanks across the battlefields of Europe, but they did. In the hands of pilots like Charles Carpenter, they proved that size and speed aren't everything, that courage and creativity can overcome almost any limitation, and that sometimes the most unlikely tools can become the most effective weapons. The evolution of close air support from World War II to the present day tells a story of continuous refinement and improvement. The early coordination between ground forces and air support was often haphazard, relying on colored panels laid out on the ground or smoke signals to mark friendly positions. Radio communications were primitive and unreliable. The concept of a forward air controller, someone on the ground or in the air who could identify targets and direct strikes, was still being developed. Today's close air support missions involve sophisticated data links connecting ground troops, aircraft satellites, and command centers. Pilots can see exactly where friendly forces are located, receive real-time target information, and deliver precision-guided munitions that can strike within meters of their intended target. Attack aircraft carry sensors that can see through darkness and weather, spot hidden enemies, and track multiple targets simultaneously. Yet, despite all this technological advancement, the core mission remains unchanged from what Carpenter and his fellow Grasshopper pilots did over France: find the enemy, mark their position, and bring firepower to bear where it will do the most good. Technology has made this easier, faster, and more precise. But the fundamental requirement for close coordination between forces in the air and forces on the ground was established by those early pioneers flying their tiny observation planes over hostile territory. The story of innovation in warfare is often told through the lens of major technological breakthroughs: radar, jet engines, nuclear weapons, stealth technology. These are the developments that make headlines and change the strategic landscape. But there's another kind of innovation, quieter and more personal, that happens when individuals adapt existing tools to new purposes, when they refuse to accept the limitations of their equipment and instead find ways to maximize its potential. Charles Carpenter's adaptation of the L-4 Grasshopper wasn't a technological breakthrough. Bazookas had existed, light aircraft had existed, and the idea of attacking ground targets from the air certainly wasn't new. What was new was the specific combination, taking an unarmed observation plane and turning it into an anti-tank platform. What was new was the tactical employment, using the aircraft's low speed and agility to sneak up on targets and attack from angles where armor was weakest. What was new was the sheer audacity of the concept. A 40-year-old history teacher hunting heavy tanks in a plane built for pleasure flying. This kind of field improvisation has always been a hallmark of American military culture, from Revolutionary War militiamen adapting hunting rifles for military use to World War II tank crews welding extra armor onto their Shermans, to modern soldiers mounting cameras on small drones to gain situational awareness. American servicemen and women have consistently shown a willingness to experiment, to try unconventional solutions, and to take calculated risks in pursuit of mission success. Carpenter's legacy is also preserved in the countless pilots who followed in his footsteps, flying different aircraft in different wars, but sharing the same mission and the same spirit. In Korea, helicopter pilots began developing the tactics that would evolve into modern air assault operations. In Vietnam, forward air controllers flying small propeller-driven planes over the jungle coordinated massive airstrikes and close support missions. In Iraq and Afghanistan, pilots of both manned and unmanned aircraft provided overwatch for ground troops, striking enemy positions and protecting American and Allied forces. Each generation of pilots learned from the experiences of those who came before, building on their successes and learning from their failures. The institutional knowledge accumulated over decades, captured in training manuals and doctrinal publications, but also passed down through stories told by veterans, lessons learned reports, and the kind of wisdom that can only be gained through actual experience in combat. As we stand today, nearly 80 years after Charles Carpenter strapped bazookas to his Grasshopper and flew into German fire, we can see how his actions rippled forward through time. The principle he demonstrated, that air power is most effective when it's closely integrated with ground operations, responsive to immediate tactical needs rather than operating according to predetermined plans, has become foundational to modern military operations. The United States Air Force's mission statement includes the phrase, "Provide air, space, and cyberspace capabilities for the joint force and the nation." That word "for" is critical. Air power isn't deployed in isolation. It's deployed in support of overall military objectives, which almost always involve troops on the ground, achieving control of territory and populations. The most sophisticated stealth bomber in the world is ultimately trying to accomplish the same thing that Carpenter accomplished in his Cub, put ordnance on target in support of ground forces. The U.S. Army, meanwhile, has never forgotten the lessons of organic aviation, aircraft controlled directly by ground commanders rather than allocated from centralized air assets. Today's Army flies thousands of helicopters, from small observation aircraft to heavy transport and attack helicopters. This capability traces directly back to those L-4 Grasshoppers and the recognition that ground commanders needed their own eyes in the sky, responsive to their immediate needs. When we talk about modern military innovation, we often focus on cutting-edge technology, artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, hypersonic weapons. These are important, and they will shape the future of warfare. But we should never forget that the most important innovations often come from the human element, from individuals who refuse to accept limitations, who see possibilities where others see only obstacles, who have the courage to try something new, even when the odds of success seem impossibly long. Charles Carpenter was that kind of innovator. He didn't have advanced degrees in engineering or aerospace design. He was a history teacher who knew how to fly and understood what needed to be done. He looked at the tools available to him, a light observation plane and some infantry anti-tank weapons, and asked a simple question. What if? What if we could combine these things? What if we could turn an observer into a hunter? What if we could prove that courage and creativity could overcome technological disadvantages? The answers to those questions changed military aviation forever. They showed that the future of combat wasn't just about building bigger, faster, more expensive aircraft. It was about integration, coordination, and flexibility. It was about giving commanders at all levels the tools they needed to respond to immediate threats. It was about fostering a culture that encouraged initiative and rewarded calculated risk-taking. As the sun set over France on September the 20th, 1944, after that long day of fog and fire and fury, Charles Carpenter climbed out of his bullet-riddled grasshopper for the last time that day. He was exhausted, his hands shaking from adrenaline and stress, his flight suit soaked with sweat, despite the autumn chill. His crew chief approached with the damage report, and it was extensive. They would need days to patch all the holes, replace damaged control cables, and restore Rosie the Rocketer to airworthy condition. But Carpenter wasn't thinking about the damage. He was thinking about the American soldiers who had escaped capture because he had stopped the German advance, even if only temporarily. He was thinking about the intelligence he had provided about enemy positions, information that would help artillery and ground forces respond effectively. He was thinking about those 2 Panther tanks sitting disabled on the battlefield, tanks that wouldn't be threatening American lives anymore. He probably wasn't thinking about legacy or military doctrine or how his actions would be remembered decades later. He was just a soldier doing his job, a teacher who had learned that sometimes the most important lessons aren't found in books, but in the crucible of experience, in moments of decision when everything hangs in the balance and you have to choose between safety and duty, between observation and action. Charles Carpenter chose action. He chose to be more than an observer in the great drama of the Second World War. And in making that choice, in strapping those bazookas to his little yellow, now olive-drab airplane, and diving into enemy fire, he helped write a new chapter in the story of military aviation. He showed that innovation doesn't always require sophisticated technology or massive budgets. Sometimes all it requires is a good idea, a willingness to try, and the courage to see it through. The Piper Cub, that humble little aircraft designed to teach Americans how to fly in peacetime, became in Carpenter's hands a weapon of war. But more than that, it became a symbol of American ingenuity, adaptability, and determination. It represented the idea that we don't have to accept the limitations imposed by our circumstances, that creative thinking and bold action can overcome almost any obstacle. Today, when military planners talk about close air support, when they design aircraft and develop tactics, when they train pilots and ground forces to work together seamlessly, they are building on foundations laid by men like Charles Carpenter. His influence is invisible but pervasive, woven into the fabric of modern military operations in ways that most people will never know or understand. But those who study military history, those who fly and fight, those who understand the evolution of air power, they know. They know that on a foggy September morning in 1944, a crazy school teacher in a Piper Cub changed warfare forever. They know that courage and creativity are force multipliers just as important as technology and numbers. They know that sometimes the most unlikely heroes achieve the most remarkable victories. Charles Carpenter returned to his classroom after the war, back to teaching the dates and names and places that make up the formal study of history. But he had become history himself, a living example of the principles he taught his students. He had shown them that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that the course of history is shaped not just by presidents and generals, but by individuals who rise to meet the challenges of their moment. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. The story of Bazooka Charlie isn't just about military innovation or close air support or the effectiveness of light aircraft in combat. It's about human potential, about what becomes possible when someone refuses to accept no or impossible as an answer. It's about the power of individual initiative within large organizations, about the importance of fostering a culture that encourages rather than stifles creative thinking. The next time you see a small plane overhead, maybe a modern descendant of the Piper Cub or a restored warbird at an air show, take a moment to remember Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer. Remember that this gentle-looking aircraft was once a weapon of war, and that the pilots who flew them were warriors every bit as brave as those who flew the famous fighters and bombers. Remember that innovation can come from anywhere, from anyone, at any time, as long as we're willing to think creatively and act boldly. The story of how a crazy schoolteacher's Piper Cub inspired modern close air support is ultimately a story about hope and possibility. It reminds us that we're not prisoners of our circumstances, that the tools and resources we have available, however limited they might seem, can be used in ways we never imagined. All it takes is the courage to try, the willingness to risk failure, and the determination to keep going, even when everyone else thinks you're crazy. Charles Carpenter was called crazy by some of his fellow pilots. He was called the Mad Major by soldiers who watched him dive into enemy fire again and again. But he was also called a hero, a lifesaver, an inspiration. He was a teacher who taught the most important lesson of all, that ordinary people, when tested by extraordinary circumstances, can achieve remarkable things. And that lesson, learned in the skies over France 8 decades ago, remains as relevant and powerful today as it was then. The technology has changed, the world has changed, but the human spirit, the capacity for courage, creativity, and determination remains eternal. That is Charles Carpenter's true legacy, and that is why his story deserves to be remembered and told generation after generation, as long as people still believe in the power of individuals to make a difference in the world.